In March 1809, a group of Finnish noblemen, clergy, and farmers gathered in the cathedral town of Porvoo, 60 kilometers east of Helsinki, and swore an oath of loyalty to Tsar Alexander I of Russia. 6 months earlier, Russian troops had crossed the border and swept through a Finland that Sweden was no longer capable of defending. The war was over. The question was what came next. What came next was something no one had designed. Alexander I, wanting to secure his western flank with a contented buffer rather than a resentful conquered province, offered Finland a deal. Keep your laws, your Lutheran church, your Swedish-derived institutions, your language of administration. Just replace the Swedish king with the Russian Tsar as your sovereign. Finland would become an autonomous Grand Duchy within the Russian Empire. Not a province, not a colony, but a state with its own government, its own courts, its own customs, and eventually its own currency, stamps, and army. For a territory that had spent 6 centuries as part of Sweden, with no independent government, no national capital, and no clear sense of itself as a distinct political entity, this was an entirely unexpected beginning. The nation that is Finland today was created, paradoxically, by the empire that conquered it. The Finnish story begins not in 1809, but in the 13th century, when Swedish crusades brought Catholicism, Swedish law, and Swedish settlers to the coastal territories of what is now southern and western Finland. The Treaty of Noteborg in 1323 formally divided the region between Sweden and the Republic of Novgorod, establishing the territorial boundary that roughly corresponds to where Swedish and Russian cultural influence met. The western and southern parts becoming Swedish Finland, the eastern part, known as Karelia, drifting into the Russian and Orthodox world. For the next 500 years, Finnish history was Swedish history. The region provided soldiers, tax revenue, timber, and strategic depth to a kingdom that used it simultaneously as a buffer against the East and a reservoir of human material for its wars. The area was integrated into Scandinavian maritime networks during the Viking Age. Under medieval Swedish rule, it received the legal and administrative structures that would shape Finnish governance for centuries. Under the Swedish Reformation, it became Lutheran, a religious identity that proved remarkably durable against every subsequent political pressure. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming videos. Thank you for your support. And now, let's continue. The relationship between Finland and Russia was defined from the very beginning by war. The border between Swedish Finland and the Russian world was never stable. It shifted repeatedly across the centuries as Sweden and Russia fought, negotiated, and fought again. Every major shift left communities on the wrong side of a new line, divided families, and created grievances that fed the next conflict. Finland's position in the Swedish Empire was that of an essential but subordinate province. It was essential because it gave Sweden control of the eastern Baltic and the Gulf of Finland, the water approaches to the territory where Peter the Great would later build St. Petersburg. It was subordinate because every senior appointment, the Governor-General, the commanders of the major fortresses at Turku, Viapuri, and Hämeenlinna, came from Stockholm, and the language of administration, law, and education was Swedish. Finnish was the language of the peasantry, the forests, and the local Lutheran clergy. It was not the language of power. In 1640, Governor-General Per Brahe the Younger established the Royal Academy of Turku, the first university in Finland. Its purpose was practical and imperial, to train a local supply of clergy and officials so that Sweden would not have to import administrators from the Swedish mainland for every position. But the institution it created became, over the following century and a half, the site where Finnish intellectual life began to develop its own momentum, producing the scholars who would, under Russian rule, assemble the Kalevala and argue for Finnish as a national language. The Finnish peasant, who lived through the 17th century, was not experiencing the Swedish imperial period as a golden age. He was being conscripted into wars across Germany and the Baltic. He was paying taxes to fund a military apparatus that served Stockholm's ambitions. In 1596, and 1597, the frustration of Finnish peasants exploded into the Cudgel War, named for the farm tools the rebels carried into battle against cavalry. It was a desperate, doomed uprising by farmers who had been pushed beyond endurance by military billeting, requisitions, and abuse by Swedish officers. The nobility suppressed it with a ruthlessness that left several thousand dead, and the peasant condition entirely unchanged. A century later, the same peasants faced a catastrophe that made the Cudgel War look minor. The summer of 1695 was abnormally cold across northern Europe. The rye did not flower until early August, and early frosts destroyed what little had grown. The following winter was the harshest in living memory. The harvest of 1696 was so poor that contemporaries recorded that each farm produced barely a single loaf of rye bread. Then came 1697, and with it the diseases that follow starvation, dysentery, typhus, typhoid, racing through a population already too weak to resist. The Finnish name for what followed is Suuret kuolemanvuodet, the Great Years of Death. By the time it ended, roughly a third of Finland's population, approximately 150,000 people out of 500,000, had died. Finnish clergy sent petitions to the Swedish king describing scenes that have no polite summary. Entire villages were empty, fields stood unplanted, roads were lined with bodies. Stockholm's response was too slow, too small, and too late. The machinery of empire was oriented toward extraction, not relief. The Great Northern War that began in 1700 brought further devastation. When Sweden's military position collapsed after Poltava in 1709, Russian forces swept through Finland. The occupation from 1713 to 1721, the Isovihan, the Great Wrath, was one of the most destructive events in Finnish history. Russian forces burned farms and towns, deported Finnish men as forced labourers, and reduced the southeastern parts of the country to near-empty desolation. Wealthy Finns who could flee to Sweden did. The peasants who remained lived under occupation. When the war ended and Sweden recovered part of Finland at the Treaty of Nystad in 1721, it recovered a country that had lost an entire generation. By 1809, when Russia finally took what was left after the Finnish War, Sweden had been so weakened that it could no longer protect its eastern province. The Russian occupation of Finland in 1808 was swift and total. Alexander III made his offer at Porvoo. Finland swore its oath, and the Grand Duchy began. What followed was the most paradoxical chapter in Finnish history. Under Russian sovereignty, Finland developed the institutions of modern statehood more rapidly than it had ever done under Swedish rule. The Senate of Finland, established in 1809, was staffed by Finns and operated in Finnish and Swedish, not Russian. Helsinki was redesigned as a capital city, its Senate Square rebuilt in the neoclassical style by the German architect Carl Ludwig Engel, projecting an image of order and permanence that made clear Finland was a permanent state, not a temporary arrangement. The Finnish national movement emerged in the 1830s and 1840s, paradoxically enabled by the Russian period's relative autonomy. Elias Lönnrot, a physician who travelled through the forests of eastern Finland collecting folk songs from rural singers, assembled the Kalevala, published in 1835, from oral material that had survived in the Finnish language for centuries, hidden in a peasant culture that Swedish administration had never thought worth suppressing. The Kalevala became the foundation text of Finnish national identity, proof that the Finnish language and Finnish people had a history, a mythology, and a cultural depth that justified political existence. The philosopher and politician Johann Wilhelm Snellman pushed the argument further. He argued in Finnish-language newspapers through the 1840s and 1850s that a people whose ruling class spoke a different language from its peasant majority could not develop genuine national consciousness. The Language Decree of 1863, issued by Tsar Alexander II, began the process by which Finnish achieved equal official status with Swedish. From that point forward, the Finnish language was no longer the tongue of the peasantry alone. It was a national language. The last phase of Russian rule, from 1899 to 1917, was the attempt at Russification. the systematic replacement of Finnish autonomy with Russian direct administration, the imposition of Russian conscription, the appointment of Russian officials to positions previously held by Finns. It failed. Finnish resistance was too organized, Finnish institutions too established, and Russian imperial authority too distracted by its own mounting crises. The general strike of 1905, triggered by the revolution spreading across Russia, forced the Tsar to restore Finnish constitutional rights. Finnish women received the right to vote in 1906, the first women in Europe to do so. On December 6, 1917, 6 weeks after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Finnish parliament declared independence. Lenin's government recognized it by the end of the year. 6 centuries of foreign sovereignty ended in a parliamentary vote in Helsinki, without a shot fired at the moment of declaration. What followed immediately was a civil war, a brutal, traumatic conflict fought in the winter of 1918 between the Finnish White Forces and the Finnish Red Guards, leaving tens of thousands dead. The Whites won. Finland became a republic in the summer of 1919. 20 years later, the Soviet Union invaded. The Winter War began in November 1939, with a Soviet offensive that the world expected to last days. It lasted 105 days at the cost of roughly 25,000 Finnish dead, and Soviet casualties that ran into the hundreds of thousands. Finland lost territory in the peace settlement. It did not lose its independence. The nation that had existed between two empires for 700 years had found, in survival against impossible odds, the clearest possible definition of itself. The Finnish word sisu, a quality approximately translated as grit, inner determination, the refusal to surrender when surrender would be rational, entered international vocabulary during the Winter War. It had been earned across every century of Finnish history, in the Cudgel War, in the Great Years of Death, in the Great Wrath, in the Russification years, and finally in the trenches of Karelia in the winter of 1939. A nation does not develop that quality from a position of comfort. It develops it from the specific experience of enduring what should not be endurable, and surviving. The story of Finland in the 20th century is, in many respects, the story of a country catching up with itself at extraordinary speed. The independent republic that emerged from civil war in 1918 had to build simultaneously the institutions of national governance, a modern economy, and a national culture, all while managing the threat posed by a Soviet Union that shared a border of over 1,000 kilometers with Finland and had demonstrated its intentions in 1939. The two wars against the Soviet Union, the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, and the Continuation War of 1941 to 1944, left Finland in a complex position at the end of the Second World War. As a country that had fought alongside Germany in the Continuation War, Finland faced the prospect of Soviet occupation or mandatory territorial concessions that could have destroyed its independence entirely. What it negotiated instead, at the price of significant reparations and the permanent cession of Karelia, was survival, and a foreign policy doctrine known informally as Finlandization, in which Finland maintained its independence and democratic institutions, while carefully avoiding any posture that the Soviet Union might interpret as hostile. This balancing act, sustained for 50 years through the Cold War, required the kind of political patience and strategic realism that Finland had been developing since the 13th century. The country that had learned to maintain its laws under Russian sovereignty, while building its national identity in the space that sovereignty left available, was the same country that maintained its democratic institutions while navigating the constraints of Soviet proximity. The skills were the same. The context had changed. Finland joined the United Nations in 1955, the European Community in 1995, and NATO in April 2023. A decision triggered by the Russian invasion of Ukraine that ended in the space of a few months. A military non-alignment policy that had been the cornerstone of Finnish foreign policy for 8 decades. The country that had spent 700 years between two empires had finally, definitively, chosen its side. The choice was not made lightly. It was made with the full weight of Finnish historical memory, of every century spent managing the space between powers that were larger, more aggressive, and less interested in Finnish survival than Finland itself. That unbroken thread from the Treaty of Noteborg in 1323 to the NATO accession in 2023 is the real story of Finland. Not just the survival. Any people can survive when circumstances permit. What is remarkable about Finland is that it survived while building simultaneously one of the highest functioning democracies, one of the best educated populations, and one of the most egalitarian societies in the world. The nation that was created by the empire that conquered it used the space that conquest inadvertently provided to become something that no empire in the end could contain.